Hello. This video is going to revolve around the piano keyboard. I'm going to show you a picture of a keyboard. We're going to talk about how that works and some other things that are related to that. If you're in class piano right now or taking lessons, which I know some of you are, you probably are already familiar with some of the things I'm going to say today, so that's fantastic. If you're not, or if you need a little refresher, then this video will help with that. And even if you do understand the keyboard layout and the piano, make sure that you watch this whole video because I will be covering some other things as well, kind of in conjunction with that, but don't just think that that's all that this is and then skip ahead, so you'll want to make sure you watch the whole thing. Okay, so just a little bit about why I'm doing this. I am a pianist, but that's not why I make you learn about the piano. I know that a lot of you play other instruments or you sing, and so you might think that the piano is not super relevant, but the reason that I do this in theory class is because I think the piano is a nice visual for some of the things that we learn in theory class. So I'm hoping that you can start to rely on it a little bit to help you with some of these concepts. If you so if you don't play the piano or you think like I'm not sure why this matters, that's why. And so hopefully it can be something that you can use to help yourself now and in the future as you start learning more stuff. It's just a nice kind of, you have the staff to think about visually, and then you can also have the keyboard, and they relate to each other in certain ways. So it's kind of nice to think about it like that. I do recommend that you somehow have a picture of a keyboard with you when you're working on stuff or when you're watching these videos. You can find a bunch on Google. I just Googled like keyboard piano and a whole bunch of images popped up. So you can find one that way. You can probably find the one I'm about to show you because it was one of the first ones. So you can find an image that way, or have it up on a tab or something like that, or you can print it off. Sometimes students like having it kind of in front of them, like on the desk, something like that. Some of you might have a piano or a keyboard like where you live, or you can always go into a practice room on one of the campuses and work with an actual piano. It's kind of nice to do that sometimes, to think about what you're learning in theory class and how it's connected to the actual sounds that you can make on the piano. So sometimes it's nice to actually go in and like do that. Or if you're working on homework, kind of like play different things that you're writing, which you'll eventually do more of that. And so I think that can be helpful, so consider that. Anyway, so let's go ahead and look at the keyboard, and I'll just kind of talk you through some of this. So this is a picture of a piano keyboard, and you'll notice that we have both white and black keys, and there's a pattern. We have 3 white keys and 2 black keys and a pattern, and then you have 4 white keys and 3 black keys in a pattern, and then that pattern continues and repeats itself. So remember I told you that when you're working with the staff, we use letters to notate the different notes, or to refer to the different notes on the staff. And we start with A and we go through G, and then we start over with A again. That's because there are 7 unique notes in what we call a scale. There are 7 unique notes before you have to start over with the same note you already had. So if I were to play this A, it would sound the same as this A, except it would be lower. We call that an octave. So we say that these A's, they sound very much the same, except one is lower than the other. So if you're ever singing, like I have a relatively high voice, but if I'm singing with my friend who's a man and he has a lower voice than me, we can still sing the same melody, but we're just singing it in different octaves. So we're not singing the exact same note, but it sounds like the same melody. So that's what happens when you get up 7 notes. Then you end up repeating what you already had, just in a different range, like a little bit higher or a little bit lower. So each white note on the piano is representing each of these letter names. So if we start here with A, and we have A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then we start over with A again. And so you'll notice that every A is within this group of 3 black notes. It falls, between number 2 and number 3, and every A will always be positioned that way. So that's something really, really nice that you'll start noticing about music theory. There's a lot of consistency in it. So once you learn where an A is located, then all of the A's are going to look like that, and that's really nice. So you don't have to like remember something different for each A on the piano. They all look the same. So even though A is at the beginning of the alphabet, for whatever reason, when we learn about the piano, we always talk about C as kind of being like the central pitch. So part of it, I think, is because of how it falls in the pattern. So it's nice to think about the pattern starting with a group of 2 black notes and then the group of 3 black notes. And so if you start right beside this group of 2 black notes, you get a C. So we often talk about C and then going up to C as being the group. So this group of 2 and this group of 3, that's one iteration of what we call an octave. And that just repeats itself over and over. And on a piano, there are many of these. On this picture, there are, like 2.5. So, because we start with this A here, we get up to a D, so it's not quite 3 full ones. Okay, so you'll notice that this keyboard is labeled, and like I said, each white note has its own letter, but the black keys do not have their own letters. The black keys have the same letters as the white keys, actually, and then they have some little symbols, and they're really tiny, so I'll have to show you a better version. I'll write some out for you in a little bit. Alright, I'm getting ahead of myself. So let me explain how the black and white keys work. Whenever you move up or down to the next adjacent note, that's called a half step. So if I were to go from this C up to the black key, because that's the next adjacent key, that would be considered a half step. From this note to this note is a half step. Or if I were to go down from C, the next adjacent note down is this B. So here I would, from this white key to this white key is down a half step. That's what I would say. And you can combine 2 half steps to make a whole step. So if I were to go up 2 half steps from this C, then to this black key, and then up again to the next adjacent note, to this D, then I have 2 half steps or 1 whole step. So I would say C up to D is a whole step. And this is where the piano is really helpful, because some notes are next to black keys and some are not. So you can't always assume that you're going to hit a black or a white key if you go up a half or a whole step. You have to look at what's happening on the piano. So if I start with C and I go up a whole step, 1, 2 half steps, to D, it's another white key. But if I'm on E and I go up a whole step, I have a half step here and another half step here. So a whole step up from E is not F, it's actually this black key here. So because of the asymmetrical nature of how the keyboard is laid out, we don't always have, that part is not always consistent. So that's when it's really helpful to memorize what a keyboard looks like, or to have one with you while you're working so that you can remember where those differences are. So most of the time, from one letter name to another, or from one white key to another, you have a whole step. But there are occasions where you don't have a black note in between, like from E to F and from B to C. Those are the 2 places where that happens. So you have to be really careful. E up to F is only a half step, not a whole step. And B up to C is only a half step and not a whole step. So you have to make sure that you keep that straight. That's one reason that I like looking at a keyboard, because if you look at a staff, all of the lines and spaces are just kind of equally distant from each other, right? And it doesn't show you visually, you can't tell that from B to C is a half step instead of a whole step. It looks just the same as any other line to space or space to line. You can't tell just by looking at it. So it's nice to have the keyboard, especially when you're just starting out learning some of these concepts, so that you can have that visual, and then eventually it'll be in your head and you'll be able to remember that. So that's kind of a nice thing. Okay, so whenever we go from one note up a whole step, up a half step, or down a half step, if we don't have a letter name for that note, then we have to use one of these symbols. And these symbols are called accidentals, and they have specific names too. So you've probably heard of this if you've been doing some music up till now, or maybe not, but we have sharps and we have flats. And a sharp means that a note has been raised by a half step. So here, if we go up from C a half step to this black key, we could call this a C sharp. Just like that. And like I said, I'll show you what that looks like. So this is very small on this page here. But there's another way that we could label this black key. We could use a flat. So if you go down a half step, you can add a flat to the letter name, and that will tell you what note you have. So if we start on D and we go down a half step, we get that same black key. But we could also call this a D flat. If we're going down from D, to think about it, we would say this is a D flat. So this note is both a C sharp and a D flat. You don't really have to remember that because you can always relate it back to the white key that you're dealing with. And there's a reason why, there are reasons why you would have one or the other, why you would call it a C sharp versus a D flat, and we would get into that like much later on in your music studies. But for right now, it's just good to know that that exists and that you can have either one. You will notate them differently on the staff, and I'll show you a little bit about that as well. But the reasons that you would notate it one or the other is something that you would learn later on. But it is important to know that you can do that in different ways, and that is how you get the names of the black keys on the piano, is by raising or lowering from a white note. So now I'll show you the staff, and I'll show you how some of this looks on the staff. If you want to go ahead and grab a picture of a keyboard so that you can keep looking at it while I show you the staff, that might be really helpful. So here I have some staff paper. Remember that you should always have a little bit of this with you, a few sheets or something like that. You can buy it or you can print it off. But this is a really handy thing. You might want to have some with you right now. And go ahead and draw along with me as we go. I'm going to start with treble clef. And hopefully by now you have memorized the names of the notes within treble clef that we're going to use. So if I go ahead and draw some notes, let's do this. If I draw those two notes, they are a step apart. Remember, we already talked about that. But we don't know what kind of step it is. We don't know if it's a whole step or a half step right now because we're not looking at the keyboard, we're just looking at the staff. But if you look back at your keyboard, you'll notice that between F and G, there is a black key. So that means to get up to G from F, you would have to count up 2 half steps or a whole step. So I would label this like a W for whole step. What would happen if I put a sharp on the F? Sharp looks like a pound sign or a hashtag. Notice how I drew the sharp, that the middle part of the sharp is exactly on that space and right in front of the note. So even though we say F sharp, when we say it, we say the letter name first, and then we say the sharp. But when you write the sharp first, and then you write the note. This is to help the performer, actually, because if you're reading a piece of music, and you come across something with an accidental, it's nice to see the accidental before you see the note. If you were to see the note first and then the accidental came later, you might accidentally play the note without the accidental first. And so it's a notation thing that is useful for performing. Because it's standardized, we want to always make sure we write it this way. Okay, so if you look back at your keyboard, find the F sharp. So start with F and go up a half step to the black key. So then if you look between that key and a G, are they adjacent keys? Or is there something in the middle? Well, the answer is that they're adjacent, so that makes this a half step. So depending on what kind of F or what kind of G I have, I could have those same notes on the same spaces and lines of the staff, but they can be changed from whole steps to half steps or vice versa depending on the accidentals that I'm using. Okay, let's look at one of those places where the white keys are touching each other. So from B up to C, that's one of them. So if I have these notes here, this looks maybe like it would be a whole step because they don't have any accidentals, but you can't just assume. You have to actually look at the keyboard and you'll notice that these are touching. So this is a half step from B to C. What if I wanted to make this into a whole step, but I wanted to use those same letter names? Well, I could either move the C up another half step to a C sharp. If you look at the keyboard, you'll notice there are 2 half steps now between those notes. Or I could actually move the first note down a half step. That would also create a whole step. So between B flat and C is a whole step. Notice again how I drew this flat. It looks kind of like a pointy lowercase b. And the flat is directly before the note, and it's covering exactly the line of the note. The line is going through its middle. And notice that my accidentals are pretty small. So let me show you some notation that isn't good. So if I were to draw, let's say I do this. That accidental is not on the same line as my note. So it's actually really sloppy and confusing. So this is a no. To make it better, I would put the sharp exactly around that line that the note is on. If I did a flat, if I made my accidental too big, same thing with making your note too big. Like, it's really hard to tell like what note I'm actually talking about with that flat. I know you think it's obvious because the next note is right there, but there are situations where there are a lot of notes on the staff together, and this would be actually really confusing in those instances. So it's really important that your notation is very precise. And the flat is exactly on the space where the note is. Okay, so remember when we're talking about notes, we're going to say the letter name first, and then if it has an accidental, we'll say the accidental on it. So we would say, this is an F sharp, this is a C sharp, this is a B flat. C sharp and C are completely different notes. Even though they share the letter, they're completely different notes on the piano. They're completely different pitches that you would sing or play. So it's important to keep that straight. And as we move on and learn about more stuff, that's going to become really important that you know that C and C sharp are really completely different. They're as different as C and F are. So even though they share a letter name and they share a space, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're in any way the same. Okay, so I hope that this was helpful, and this just gives you a little bit of an idea. Just to recap, let me go ahead and put this video back on to me. Okay, hi, here I am again. So just to recap what this video covered, we covered the layout of the keyboard. We covered what whole and half steps are, how to find them both on the keyboard and on the staff. When you're working with a staff, especially if you're kind of new to notation, it's good to have a keyboard with you so that you can see visually where the whole and half steps are. We talked about accidentals, both sharps and flats, and how to notate those on the staff. And then we talked about, what else did we do? Oh, notation, yeah. So make sure that when you write your notes, write your sharps and flats, they all have to be very clear. It has to be very precise. And I will eventually have you writing out some notation for me so that I can make sure that your notation handwriting is good. It's really important to have a pretty sharp pencil, to use pencil so you can erase it if you make a mistake. And you know, my staff paper is actually kind of tiny, so you might want to choose something that's a little bit bigger while you're still learning how to do some of this. But I like it because it fits a lot onto one page, but it's not always good because I have to draw my notes really, really small, and that can sometimes be hard. But yeah, so this is what we're gonna jump from and do a little more with eventually. And as always, if you have questions, please let me know. I'll talk to you soon.